Cool. So welcome, everyone, to our post-lunch panel on governing the AI value chain. I know discussing value chains right after lunch might seem like a recipe for a collective food coma. But I promise you this topic is as spicy as it gets in AI governance. And that's about all the food puns I've got for today. But in all seriousness, the concept of the value chain is fascinating. It's critical, how we grapple with how to effectively govern the value chain for general purpose AI. And what do we mean when we talk about the value chain, right? Let's get the definitions out of the way, but we'll also hear from our panelists. We're really discussing the supply chain, so the entire ecosystem of actors involved in bringing an AI system to the market and maintaining it. We use the term value chain to align with terminology and regulatory frameworks like the EU AI Act. I don't know why I'm looking at Kai, like he had something to do with it, but maybe you did. And to illustrate why governance across this value chain matters so much, let's look at a recent incident with major real-world repercussions. So in July 2024, a bad software update from cybersecurity firms CrowdStrike caused widespread failures. So I'm looking at the numbers here, and it's widespread system crashes leading to over $5.4 billion in damages to Fortune 500 companies. Delta Airlines alone faced $500 million in losses and canceled 7,000 flights. So this incident really highlights the complexities of software liability and the far-reaching impacts of failures in the technology supply chain. So as general-purpose AI systems become increasingly capable of automating economically valuable tasks, this integration into our economy could be far more pervasive and transformative than traditional software. So this makes effective governance across the AI value chain incredibly important. So to address these challenges, the Partnership on AI recently published a resource on governing the value chain of open foundation models. This was developed in collaboration with organizations like GitHub. We're going to hear more from Peter and ACLU, and we're going to hear from Escher as well. And what the resource essentially does is identify actors in the value chain and outline responsibilities. We kind of suggest responsibilities for each of those actors in the value chain. But let's hear directly from our expert panelists about what this value chain approach means for AI governance. Is this framework helpful? Is it challenging? Is it perhaps a bit of both? And to do this, we have Peter from GitHub, we have Escher from ACLU, and we have Kai, who advises on digital policy in the EU Parliament. And I'm going to start with the first question, and it's going to be the same question. I say question, it's questions. First for Peter, and then for Isha, which is, as a key collaborator in developing the Open Foundation Model Value Chain Framework, could you explain what this value chain approach is and why it's important in the context of general purpose AI? And the second question, how does it differ from current model-based regulatory proposals like California's SB 1047?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Madhu, for your leadership in both kind of producing this incredible guidance, but also helping me answer this question by defining the value chain a bit to get things started. But I think it really is helpful to underline that just like any complex project, complex product, there are going to be a number of actors and actions that are taken to yield a functioning AI system in the end. And that might cross borders, like we've heard quite a bit of conversation earlier today. I think the value chain lens, before we get to the guidance in particular, is really helpful in underlining the range of actors and actions that can be taken to support responsible development. It's also important to underline in the context of general purpose AI models, there's a lot of focus on these models, that they're just one piece in the value chain that yields a functioning AI system that works in the world and can implicate and harm or support individuals using or interacting with that end system. So this value chain is useful in underlining that the model itself is not the end product. We think about that a lot at GitHub because we serve the interests and support open source software development communities and developers. They're often interacting with these intermediate outputs, so thinking about a model that's placed on the likes of GitHub or Hugging Face, as opposed to something that hits an end user directly. Often policy conversations kind of conflate a system and a model, and this is a useful lens, the value chain, to underline that these things are distinct. The developer of a model, whether that be a closed or openly available model, does not have the end say in what happens downstream. So this framework and the guidance are really helpful in outlining a series of additional actors, including model hubs like GitHub, downstream modifiers who may fine-tune the model, as well as app developers that ultimately will integrate a model into an application that an end user can use, along with additional software like safety filters. Each of those actors have distinct roles and responsibilities in an ethical value chain. Often, as I kind of teased, regulation might not fully appreciate that. I appreciate Kai and your work because I think the AI Act did end up in a pretty good place. There are direct model obligations, but there's this important understanding that there is a value chain and documentation should be shared along it, and that collaboration should be anticipated along it with distinct and reduced responsibilities for open source communities that might not be able to comply as if they were a multinational corporation offering a product to an end user. So that's helpful. Other jurisdictions have not done quite as good of a job, and I think there really is this tension to understand the value chain because if we're expecting developers of models to dictate what systems do, we are precluding certain value chains from existing. And we need to be very careful about the open source community in particular. And I think I won't go any spicier with the take on particular regulations, but I think it's really important that we do understand that value chain and also how it's evolving. Because the value chain constantly changes. I think our report was really helpful in outlining what it was in 2024 in April, but continuing to follow developments will support agile regulation as we move forward.
Yeah. So I tried. Isha, do you want to try? Do you want to tell us what you think about the California bill? No. No pressure. Yeah.
I will say, speaking from the perspective at the ACLU, where we're very focused on mitigating present and existing harms from AI that we have, as Amba mentioned earlier, have been documented and have not been sufficiently addressed. I think the value of the value chain approach is that it also illuminates potential targets for future regulation or enforcement. And it identifies different layers, different points in the value chain where intervention might be most useful or efficient. And I think that obviously the California regulation is very much focused on developers. And then there are other civil rights laws, for example, other federal laws that might be focused on end users of a system. But I think what the value chain shows us is there's actually a lot of points of intervention along the way. And what I think regulation should be most interested in is what is the most logical or efficient point to regulate against a particular harm in context. And so I'll just give an example. There has been a recent decision in the Northern District of California, a federal district court, in the Mobley v. Workday litigation, which involves someone claiming that they were subject to discrimination in violation of federal civil rights laws when applying to jobs and using the Workday platform system, which screens applicants for jobs. And this person said that they were consistently rejected and that they allege bias in the system. And one of the legal issues in that case was who's ultimately responsible? Is it the employer that used the screening tool? Is it the vendor, Workday? Is it someone further up in the development process? And in that case, the court held that actually the vendor could be liable under a reading of the law that the vendor was an agent of the employer. And I won't get into the legal minutia of that, but I think the reason that is a significant decision for those of us in the civil rights community is that in the context of these types of hiring screening tools, for example, it's not actually efficient to enforce against every potential employer in the country. We're talking millions who might be using a tool that's very slightly perhaps customized for them, but essentially being sold by a particular vendor. And in fact, the employers likely don't have the information about the tool that would make them efficient or useful targets of regulation or enforcement. So in fact, enforcement one stage above in the value chain at the vendor level here is just a much more efficient and logical approach. Now, that may not be true in every context. I'm using this as an example. But what the value chain can illuminate is that it's not going to make sense to necessarily regulate or intervene or enforce in the same place in the value chain for every system. It will depend on the context. But by eliminating the potential avenues, I think it gives us more regulatory options, and it gives the civil society more options as well in terms of pushing for regulation at different levels. And then the last thing I'll say, which I think was important for me participating in this process, was really expanding the universe of who is in the value chain beyond just the end user. We can talk about many systems that involve users, but that are acted upon other people. So obvious ones being facial recognition technology used by law enforcement when it's government use acts upon people subject to the facial recognition technology. And they are key stakeholders in this and should not be, the value chain cannot cut off at the user level. And then we can even go beyond that, right? There are people who might not even have a tool act upon them, but who would change their behavior in light of the existence of a tool. So again, you can think of facial recognition built on surveillance systems. Is that going to change the behavior of particular communities? Or hiring tools that consistently screen or favor certain values. Will people start to change their behaviors and experiences to operate in a society in which these tools are making critical decisions? So that's an expansive view of the value chain that I would encourage us all to think of.
Great. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Esha. One of the things that I heard yesterday at a workshop on documentation in the value chain was this term responsibility hot potato, which is you have a value chain, there's kind of this, we all have this opportunity to point at the other person in the value chain. And I feel like you might maybe have spicy takes on this, which is, in your view, how well do existing policy approaches, such as the EU AI Act and the upcoming General Purpose AI Code of Practice, really account for the full spectrum of actors in the AI ecosystem? And second question, what might be gained or lost by adopting a more comprehensive value chain perspective?
Yeah. First of all, many thanks for the invitation. Really timely, again, now with California, but also with our code of practice that we talked already about, that are currently prepared, or the preparation is prepared. At the moment, we are all waiting for the announcement of the shares, which should come soon. Many important things have already been said. Maybe I come back to some of them also, but let me start with what we in the European Union did, because the beginning was looking completely different. The European Commission had a typical product safety legislation approach, which, we heard it already, would have really concentrated on the downstream actors. So in product safety legislation, so-called new legislative framework, it's really the downstream companies, so this company that is finally commercializing an AI product, an AI system, that needs to fulfill all the obligations, technical documentation, risk management, human oversight, and so on. And as it was being said already, often this downstream company doesn't really have a clue what they bought from some upstream companies, what is happening in a training data set of a model, what actually or how different parts of the society are represented in a data set that, I will drop a name, this company was buying from Oracle, and so on and so on. And because of that, we were thinking, and it's actually a really unique situation, that there was a cross-party understanding from Social Democrats, liberals, Greens, but also conservatives, where we all found, based on different ideologies or different focus areas, this is unfair, it's not good for consumers, it's not good for civil society in a broader space, but it's also not good for our political group, for SMEs. If you are thinking about how the European economy is looking like, mainly it's smaller companies, downstream companies. 99% of our digital economy are actually SMEs. So if we would now, with the AI Act, create a legal framework that is only focusing on them and creating a situation that those SMEs lack information, lack access to data, and so on, we would basically shoot ourselves again as European regulator in the foot. And our attempt to catch up with the US, with Chinese AI companies would be lost from the beginning. This again was the reason why we came together and said, okay, we have a proposal that doesn't really reflect reality. We need to change it. And even for our political group, we normally always want an impact assessment, want a lot of evidence. Yeah, in this case, there was not really evidence, and people like Peter actually helped us a lot to understand the whole process. And then we did it rather fast. Based on a brainstorming, and added a whole chapter on, first of all, information sharing along the AI value chain that I talked about, but then also thinking about the model, thinking again from our camp especially, that there are certain model providers that have a very, very, let's say, dominant market position, that probably will release models that have a huge impact on, again, civil society and so on. And then, indeed, we wanted to make sure that already on this level, those systems, or those models in particular, are at least coming a little bit closer to those obligations in downstream. And final point, as I just said, we did it basically on the go without impact assessment, without long discussions or public consultation. And unfortunately then, the technical levels on my side is still angry about it. The political level told us, it's over, you need to stop now because the European election is coming and we want the AI Act being celebrated kind of before. And this is why in a stage of a, let's say, second brainstorming, we needed to stop. And this really now final sentence or final point, you see it now. I would say that conceptually, it's a really good idea. I fully believe in it. I fully support it. But legally, our GPAI chapter is not fully sound. There are a lot of procedural questions. There are legal definitions that do not really make sense. And this is going to your last point or last question. The big issue with the European approach right now is that no one really fully understands what to do, what does it mean, and hopefully this already mentioned code of practice on general purpose AI models will help us, help the community to better understand it. And they, of course, have the big advantage that they are basically a typical product of public-private partnership. So hopefully all actors that have something to say are being involved and making sure that the final product is working and is really complementing the AI Act.
Thanks, Guy. On the subject of not understanding what's going on, I'm going to shift to what are AI agents or advanced assistants? I'm going to pitch this to Peter. How might the emergence of AI agents shift the dynamics in the value chain? Because I mean, clearly a lot of hard work has gone in the EU, and now apparently there could be a step change in capability that obviously shifts the value chain. And to your point, Peter, I mean, yeah, this is going to change every year, arguably. But that does kind of bring into tension, what would it mean for existing, policy discourse? This kind of, like what kind of shift do you anticipate? Or maybe there's no shift, and it's quite, similar to what we already know these systems can do. And then how would it disrupt the existing policy discourse?
How much time do we have? See, not too much. I'll try to be brief, but maybe more conversations offline as well. So I'm from San Francisco, and in San Francisco, it seems like there's a hackathon every weekend of folks trying to build agents to do automate various tasks and kind of create the new revolutionary product. So it's clearly an active area of attention and R&D. I would offer a definition of an agent as an AI system that's capable of planning and taking action to affect goals in an environment. It's a pretty generic definition. It sounds a lot like what has been happening for decades in AI research, and in fact, it has been around for quite a while. But foundation models have offered themselves or have become an engine, I would say, to yield a somewhat effective agent-like capabilities in research and development contexts, in hackathons and the like. They really do help, I guess, motivate the value chain perspective because, yes, we can talk about models, but frameworks that came out just after GPT-4, we think of AutoGPT as an open source framework last year, AutoGen, an open source framework LangChain, another open source framework. Developers are building with software on top of models that are supporting iterative calls that can do chain of thought, so you can get a more kind of concrete answer with many, a more useful answer with many prompts, or automate chains of tasks. So somebody could ask for, in plain language, build me a Tetris app, and a system would yield a compiled and functioning game. What does this mean for policy? I think in some ways it's too early to say, but I would offer, we have existing laws, and to Amba's point earlier, we can go and think about enforcing those. Existing liability regimes are going to be useful. If a user is going to adopt this, they'll likely want assurances that it works. So I'm not too paranoid. What I would offer is the value chain, again, is a very useful lens for us to continue to follow these development practices and ask questions of companies that are doing things maybe less in the open than the open source community, because a lot of this development is happening in integrated, vertically integrated contexts, and it might be useful to understand the practices, whether they're living up to the principles of human-centered and responsible development.
Yeah, so I'm going to check in with Kai to see if you're paranoid. Should we be thinking about liability differently for AI agents? I think Peter's landing on maybe not. Maybe enforcing is more important than rethinking liability. But yeah, how do you feel about liability for AI agents, and how is the EU code of practice being adapted to address this new paradigm?
Yeah. So very, very unlikely we will find something in the code of practice, because it's only complementing the AI Act, and typical EU, there's a different work stream that is focusing on liability, which is actually a problem, because like so often our laws are not really streamlined. There are different, for example, open source definitions in our product liability directive, and also our AI liability directive, or in our AI Act. I just said AI liability directive. This is a proposal that is currently not really discussed yet, but we just had a presentation of a study yesterday that was looking into it, comparing the PLD, so Product Liability Directive, the AI Act, and this new AI Liability Directive, and is saying there are still a few legal gaps. We need to think actually more about the value chain. We need to make sure that different companies or entities share the burden, share the liability risk. And I cannot really go into detail, because we haven't made any decision as European Parliament, not even if we are going ahead with this proposal. But one idea, of course, would be to copy-paste a little bit from the GDPR, so our privacy law, this concept of joint controllership, or in this case, then joint liability. And then, of course, there are different ways. You could say, like we in the Parliament proposed, that it will be always the operators that will be directly liable towards the harmed person, or the person that suffered a damage. And then this operator could go into internal redress. You could say that the harmed person can take redress or ask for a redress no matter to whom, so to OpenAI, to the operator, to data set provider, or whatsoever. And there are a lot of middle ground solutions. But what we are choosing in the end, again, is right now completely unclear. But yeah, it will be probably the next big battle in Europe on digital policy matters, and especially on AI. But again, the message right now, it will not be mentioned in the code of practice on GPI models.
Great. I'm looking at we have about 5 minutes. So I want to pose this question to each one of you, starting with Esha, which is, so we end on a more fun note, which is, if you had a magic wand, what is one thing that you'd like to see less of, or that doesn't need as much focus in AI safety conversations?
I think we need less of a focus on the doomsday scenarios, and I know I'm echoing some comments that others have made. I think it's often very tempting for regulators, for the media, and for civil society as well, to kind of focus on the big picture existential harms. And I think there's obviously room for that conversation, but what can often happen is that regulation and regulatory and legislative attention can then shift from dealing with the very concrete, perhaps unsexy harms that we're seeing currently, and even from enforcing existing laws vis-a-vis models that are in use. So again, there's a very necessary conversation happening about what new laws do we need, and we definitely need new laws. But for example, when I talk about existing civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination in certain contexts, even those haven't been sufficiently enforced yet, and the buck does stop with people who are subject to those laws. If you're an employer, if you're a financial institution, if you're law enforcement that has to respect the rights of your community, right? Those existing obligations and duties exist, and simply saying AI doesn't absolve those downstream actors from those obligations. So I wish we'd see less of the pie in the sky doomsday discussion and more of a focus on what enforcement can we do with existing laws now, and to push back against some of the AI exceptionalism when what we're seeing is just old-fashioned discrimination or denial of due process effectuated through certain tools. And those are safety harms as well.
That's right. Peter?
A somewhat related point, I think if I could wave my wand, I would see less discussion and rhetoric around national security as a key motivator for policy. I really am grateful to the NTIA for seeing through a lot of the discourse that we saw, particularly in the open source conversation the past year, about national security risks as motivating policy. I think the NTIA ended up in a pretty good place. In practice, this could be crying wolf and using something prior to when the risks are actually relevant to speak of in the future, should they arrive. Dan Dresner put this really well in a recent foreign affairs element. This is much broader than AI. We have a very small piece of this, but right-sizing the definition of national security is really an important priority for policy. We should do our small part within the community by toning down the rhetoric and really trying to work on productive conversation for regulation as opposed to raising national security emergency planning as a separate thing.
2 points. I try to keep it in time. First of all, it's a value chain point. I would really like to see more SMEs, but even larger companies like Siemens, Schneider Electronic, and whoever, SAP, to be more involved. They do understand that, again, it's about them, so helping them to become compliant with the AI Act, with other digital laws, but honestly, the most active actors in the European Union are the typical ones, Google, Meta, and so on, which I honestly do not understand. The policy people in those SMEs or larger EU companies also do not understand it, but it's really the C-level that is not allowing them or pushing them to be more involved. So hopefully this really changes, because otherwise it's really, I need to say, their fault. We offered them now a huge opportunity. If they don't take it, then the second point is basically complementing what my both co-panelists have said. In the European Union, we have, again, a lot of silos that are not really interconnected. With the AI Act, we have now one horizontal AI framework, which is bringing forward some general principles, but now it's about implementing those general principles. For example, in the financial area, or in, let's say, public services, where we are fighting against certain biases and so on. But often, those different work silos are also in Europe not really working with each other. So yeah, now it's basically all about bringing all this expertise that we have now in the AI policy bubble, let's say, in those other bubbles, and hopefully make them understood what those general principles are, how to best implement them, and so on. So it's really all about cooperation, not only along the value chain, but also in the public sector.
Well, I hope there are folks from other parts, other bubbles, as you put it. I think there are in this room, and you should find us after the panel. As a moderator, you wake up and often choose violence, which is, I want people to disagree, but unfortunately, there's a lot of agreement on this panel. So we're going to move forward with questions, and maybe you can provoke a response from us, which is, so we have 10 minutes. So we're going to open up the floor for questions from audience. I don't know if we have any takers yet. Remember, questions are those things that typically start with why, how, or what, not to be confused with comments, which often begin with I think or in my experience. I work with Claude to pull this out. Anyone want to offer up? Wow.
What an excellent job the panel has done if this room has no questions. Reminder to state your name and organization before the question, please.
And please identify the speaker as well that you want to direct the question to.
This is for the full panel.
Okay, great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Georgievsky. I'm from Sony. Yesterday, the partnership and I hosted a wonderful workshop that included discussions about the AI supply chain. We talked about, how we can information share, transparency documentation, incident reporting, et cetera. And typical for us to throw out other types of industries that we say. So we heard, well, what are the airlines industry doing? What are pharmaceuticals? What are the open source communities doing? For each of the panelists, what are the analogous or existing frameworks that you see in other industries that might be a good model when we're trying to figure out issues down the AI supply chain?
I can maybe start because it's a short point. I have not a lot of knowledge in cybersecurity, but what I always hear is that, especially when it comes to NIS2, so critical infrastructure, now also the new Cyber Resilience Act and so on, there's actually already a lot of elements in how different actors need to work together, because also cybersecurity is a topic that goes along the AI value chain. And they found quite good mechanisms how to promote cooperations, how to opening up certain, let's call it information silos and so on. So this is actually something that the Commission, the AI office will look into and hopefully will cooperate quite closely with.
I can offer an answer, I guess, embedded where I spend a lot of time thinking about open source software communities and maybe complementing open source AI, which, there's all sorts of fun conversations. To what extent can we truly draw parallels? What I think is important to underline is that in open source software conversations, policy is really focused on downstream use of software integrated into products, the idea that the product is being offered on the market, the assurance, the obligation should fall on the person trying to make a profit from that. Why has that worked? Well, because source code is directly scrutable, it can be altered, and some of these things might not necessarily follow directly with AI. However, it's helpful to follow the important work at the Open Source Initiative, who is the arbiter of both the definition of software and AI in the context of open source. And if we understand their definition, which is you must document the data, the high level that you've used, you should provide the training code associated with the model, and then the model weights themselves, a downstream actor really does have a lot of the kind of capabilities, direct access they need to modify something to comply with a regulation. So I think there's a lot to be kind of looked to in saying, if a community is making something freely available and building into the commons, if we think about a digital public good, the expectation should be a bit lower on them, and that people trying to make a profit downstream should face a higher obligation. However, that only really works when you can truly meet the definition of open source as opposed to people who might be using that term a little bit more flippantly.
The only thing I'd add is I think civil society is often out of those information sharing streams or those conversations early on. And one of the things that I think is necessary is also building up capacity of civil society, technical knowledge, legal knowledge, to be able to participate meaningfully in those conversations and early stage collaborations. I do think there's a tension there, however. Often civil society's participation, can be viewed suspiciously by civil society members as sort of an attempt to sort of wash away problems, right? We brought you in as part of the consultative process, so any problems that happen later, we're not responsible for because we consulted with civil society. And on the flip side, I would say there's a hesitation on civil society's part to feel co-opted or to feel that their participation means they can't turn around later and attempt to enforce violations of laws or participate in regulatory measures. So I think there's a tension there that needs to be resolved, but I do think there's a need to not categorically exclude civil society from those collaborations.
Thank you so
Hi, everyone. My name is Bogdana, and I'm with the Responsible AI team at DLA Piper. And I was also actually together with Tiffany at that fantastic documentation workshop yesterday. And a lot of what we talked about was actually about the notion of responsible disclosure and how currently a lot of that, well, some of that happens in user agreements. Right, and however, they're like extremely limited in terms of informing consumers about risks and harms of AI. And my question was with regards to the EU AI liability directive. And I'm very curious about what do you wish existed, or how should we be thinking about this differently than product liability in order to both sort of disclose responsibly and provide a way for meaningful contestability from a consumer perspective. And yeah, very curious about your thoughts on how could it evolve in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm known for being extremely blunt and outspoken, but on this topic, I actually right now cannot really talk because in the parliament, there was not yet the go to start the discussions and so on. And in those moments, it's always a bit tricky and could backfire quite a lot if I say something public. But maybe for you, quite interesting is to read the studies that I was talking about. It's, as I said yesterday, being released by the European Parliament Research Service. Professor Philipp Hacker from Germany was writing it. And he was actually reflecting a lot of those points that you were talking about, but also many others. And again, also thinking about this issue, okay, in the PLD, in the Product Liability Directive, it's mainly about B2C, so consumers, customers. While, yeah, maybe in the AI Liability Directive, we could go a little bit more upstream and think about B2B, but then also think about disclosure and other things that are actually also good for the this C level, and the PLD. But yeah, anything or any political statements I cannot do right now, sorry.
Tough luck. Can we take another question, or are we at time? Or we can take one more question. Great.
Hi, this is Amrita. I'm with the Center for Internet and Society in India. We're doing a project on AI and healthcare, looking particularly at the data supply chain for AI. And one of the questions that I had was, when we're thinking about the governance of the value chain, we know that there are cross-border data flows. And within India, like the problem we're facing is that a lot of the data that is being used to train AI models is actually public data that is coming from TensorFlow and things like that. And if you're using that data to screen breast cancer in Indian women through radiology, because radiology is one of the use cases that is being optimized for AI, there are potential problems there. So how are we thinking about, because the conversation on governance often is very global and at a very sort of like global level, and it doesn't actually translate down to what people are actually facing. So I wanted to check how we are thinking about these questions of like local contextual data flows. And the second question was also around liability, particularly within healthcare, because a lot of what we spoke to doctors, and a lot of what was coming up was that if we start using AI, which is not something in our control, but it is a private hospital that has deployed this system, we may face liability concerns. So also the question on liability and who is the actor who should be held liable in these instances.
I'm really glad you brought up the data flows issue, because that's something I neglected to mention, but was in my mind as well as part of the value chain. If we want a holistic value chain, we also have to look at whose data is included, how much consent and control they had over that. And so I think a full value chain would account for that. And there might be a disconnect, as you note. There might be foundation models where, all along the value chain, you've got stakeholders, and then you've got a data set that's completely orthogonal. It's coming from what was convenient, it's coming from what was available, not necessarily actually appropriate for use there. So I think that that's an issue that I think is common to all regulatory approaches, is how do we square that? In the United States, of course, the lack of comprehensive privacy regulation is an issue. In other jurisdictions, there are privacy laws. There are sometimes patchworks that might apply. But I think this is a big gap currently in how we think about value chains. Like, where is the data coming from? Is it a global data stream subject to different jurisdictions' privacy laws? And does that just mean that the data that's then used is what is convenient or can legally be accessed, rather than what's most relevant or safest or appropriate?
Do either of you want to take it up?
Maybe shortly. So in the European Union, we have 3 layers, basically, where we are looking into the data sets and doing data governance. So I said already, we have this general purpose AI model layer, upstream layer, especially those that we are considering systemic, so that are heavily used, that are having certain risky outlooks, and so on and so on. They need to perform a data governance. They need to fulfill certain minimum criteria. It's not going super into detail, but already there you would need to make sure that, for example, the data set is to a certain extent representative, or at least inform about how the data set is put together. So for example, if there is for a potential health use case, there is a certain region not included at all, a company like OpenAI would need to make this information available via technical documentation. Then along the value chain, the second level would be, let's call it component level. So in my example, if a downstream provider would take an Oracle data set, also Oracle in this case would need to cooperate really closely with this company, would need to provide technical access, actually, also a lot of information, would maybe even need to cooperate with this downstream company to make it work. And the downstream company on level 3 as high risk AI system provider would need to fulfill Article 10, which is basically saying your data governance needs to make sure that the data set is fully representative, and so on and so on. And all of that is then complemented via technical standards that are going even more into detail. And then, luckily, because this is one of the big problems with the AI Act, would be able to make sectorial or also regional differences. So in your case, make sure that the health sector has a little bit of different requirements than, let's say, the critical infrastructure and so on. Yeah, this is our approach, and maybe because you were talking about India, our approach doesn't really differ very much from the G20 AI ethicals that are coming from the OECD from 2019. So also in India, even though you don't have a hard AI law, let's say, those horizontal principles do have an effect already, or should have an effect, because India signed basically those principles in terms of G20. So at least, let's say, on a sectorial level, also in India, authorities should take those principles already into account.
Okay, so I can see we are at time. It's clear that having the last word on something as dynamic as the AI value chain is nearly impossible. So what I'm really saying is we should pencil in and have this panel again this time next year. I want to extend my sincere thanks to our panelists, Esha, Peter, and Kai. To our audience, thank you for your participation. And yeah, thank you all for being part of this conversation.